When kiln forming glass, it is necessary to place a separator between the glass and the kiln shelf. Hot glass is sticky and will adhere to the shelf if not prevented by a separator. Because glass and ceramic are incompatible, once glass is stuck to a kiln shelf, it will break. In trying to remove it, you will damage the shelf and the glass. By learning to separate glass from the kiln shelf, you will avoid problems with glass sticking and breaking. Several types of shelf separators are available. In this lesson, we will focus on Bullseye Shelf Primer. At Bullseye, we use shelf primer in many cases because it is economical, easy to use, and has minimal environmental impact. In this lesson, you will learn what shelf primer is made of and how it works, the tools necessary for working with shelf primer, how to work safely with shelf primer, how to prepare shelf primer for application, how to apply shelf primer to a kiln shelf, how to kiln dry a freshly primed shelf, how to identify a glass surface that has been fired in contact with shelf primer, when to remove old shelf primer and apply a new coat, and how to remove and dispose of old shelf primer and clean up the work area. Bullseye Shelf Primer is a simple mixture of 3 dry ingredients: kaolin, alumina hydrate, and a pink colorant which is composed of organic material. The slow dehydration of the kaolin and alumina hydrate throughout the upper temperature range of the fusing process prevents the glass from forming a bond with the ceramic shelf. Dry shelf primer is a respiratory irritant. Always avoid inhaling dusts by wearing an appropriate respirator with a NIOSH-approved P100 or N95 filter while mixing and cleaning up. Local ventilation can greatly reduce your exposure to dust during shelf preparation. Using a vacuum with a HEPA or high-efficiency particulate air filter will further ensure your safety during cleanup. Some people wear gloves when working with shelf primer because it can stain and dry the hands. To prepare for application, you will need a measuring cup, a bucket with a tight-fitting lid, a stirring device, and a sponge for cleanup. A wide, fine-bristled brush, such as a hake brush, is an excellent applicator. When it's necessary to remove old primer from a kiln shelf, you will need a scraper, a non-metallic scrubbing pad, and a dusting brush. We also recommend that you have an appropriate respirator for filtering airborne particulates. Once your tools are assembled, it's time to inspect the condition of your shelf. It should be free of dust and oils, which could prevent uniform application of primer. The shelf should also be completely dry. It may be necessary to remove old primer from a shelf before applying a new coat. We will explain how to do this later in the lesson. Bullseye Shelf Primer needs to be mixed with water before application. Standard instructions call for mixing 1 part dry primer to 5 parts water. Measure 5 cups of water into the clean bucket. Then slowly add 1 cup of dry shelf primer. Stir well and let it sit for a few minutes to allow the powder to slake or hydrate. Once prepared, Bullseye Shelf Primer can be stored in an airtight container for up to several months. Because shelf primer tends to settle out easily, frequent stirring is essential. Watch how the color changes as the primer is stirred. To begin application, saturate the hake brush well. Gently wipe off the excess on the inside edge of the bucket and apply the primer to the shelf in long parallel strokes running in the same direction. Always brush each coat in the same direction, flipping the brush so you can apply 2 strokes each time you dip the brush. Once the first coat is complete, start the second, this time brushing front to back in strokes that are perpendicular to the direction of the first coat. Each time you load the brush, give the primer a small stir to keep all of the ingredients in suspension. Wipe off the excess on the inside edge of the bucket. The third coat of primer should be run on the diagonal from corner to corner, starting down the center of the shelf. Changing directions with each coat you brush on will ensure full, even coverage across the shelf, and it will prevent the buildup of heavy grooves and brush marks that will leave an impression on the bottom of your fired glass. The fourth coat of primer should be made by brushing from side to side, parallel to the first coat, but starting on the opposite edge of the shelf. The strokes in the fifth and final coat should run perpendicular to those in the fourth. Together, these 5 coats will build a firing surface that is as smooth and even as possible. Once you've finished applying shelf primer, clean up any spills or drips before they dry and become airborne. Upon firing, a damp shelf will release moisture that can get trapped beneath the glass. This will turn to steam at fusing temperatures and create a bubble or bubbles in the fired glass. A wet shelf can also cause small needle points to form on the perimeter of the piece, and it can cause primer to stick to the glass, potentially affecting the surface. These problems are easily prevented by thoroughly drying the shelf in the kiln. Shelves that appear dry to the touch may still hold moisture. When kiln drying the shelf, leave the kiln door open about 1/2 inch to prevent corrosion of the kiln's metal parts. Remove the plugs from the peepholes. Fire the kiln as fast as possible to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Hold for 20 minutes. After the kiln has completed its cycle, the kiln and shelf can be cooled rapidly by opening the kiln door. Once the kiln and shelf have cooled to room temperature, the shelf is now adequately dried and ready for kiln-forming glass. Wait, however, until the shelf is cool before arranging glass on it. Cold glass, placed on a hot shelf, may break due to thermal shock. Glass picks up the texture of the surface on which it is fired. When fired on shelf primer, it may pick up the texture of the brush strokes. Careful application of primer, including changing the direction of your strokes, will minimize this texture. Once shelf primer has been fired hotter than 1300 degrees Fahrenheit, it will no longer resist sticking to glass. The pink dye will have burned out, leaving the shelf white and needing a fresh coat of primer. Remove the fired primer using a scraper. Start by cleaning the edge closest to you by scraping horizontally. Remove the remaining primer by scraping from the cleaned edge toward the opposite edge using long, continuous parallel strokes. By working in this way, most of the old primer will fall along one edge, making it easier to clean up. Once you've finished scraping, use a non-metallic scrubby to clean any stubborn spots. Brush the residual powder off to one side of the shelf. If the primer was carefully applied, the shelf should be relatively clean on the edges and bottom. But be sure to check these areas and remove any drips that could contaminate the glass in future firings. Finally, clean up the debris. Using a vacuum with a HEPA filter is the most effective cleanup method because it minimizes dust. Alternatively, you may clean up with a sponge and water to keep dust down. Once the shelf has been scraped, It can be prepared with fresh primer for future firing.